What drives someone to take another person's life? We often imagine murder motives rooted in passion, greed, or revenge stories that, while tragic, still feel somehow recognizable. But sometimes the reasons behind these unthinkable acts cross into territory so strange, so bewildering, that they challenge our very understanding of human behavior. Today, we're venturing into some of the most unusual and chilling cases in American history, stories where the line between reality and absurdity blurs in ways you have to hear to believe. These aren't just crimes, they're windows into the deepest, darkest, and often most illogical corners of the human psyche. From disputes over trivial possessions to beliefs that defy all reason, the motives we're about to explore remind us that truth can be far stranger than fiction. Each case carries its own weight, a life lost, a family shattered, and yet the explanations behind them linger in that unsettling space between tragedy and sheer disbelief. Join me as we uncover 33 of the most bizarre murder motives in the United States. We'll move through these stories with a sense of solemn curiosity, honoring the gravity of each life affected while also acknowledging how profoundly strange human actions can be. This journey isn't about sensationalism, it's about exploration. It's about asking why and discovering that sometimes the answer is something beyond anything we could ever expect. Our journey into the bizarre begins not in the shadows of the adult world, but in the seemingly innocent realm of childhood imagination. In 2014, in a quiet town in Wisconsin, two 12-year-old girls invited their friend for a sleepover. To the outside world, it was a typical childhood activity, but these two young girls were deeply immersed in an online fictional universe centered around a terrifying figure known as the Slender Man, a tall, faceless entity in a suit who allegedly haunted woods and abducted children. This internet-born boogeyman, a piece of fictional horror known as a creepypasta, had transcended the screen for them. They had come to believe he was not only real but that he demanded a terrible sacrifice. To prove their worth to him and to prevent him from harming their own families, they lured their friend into the woods and stabbed her 19 times. Miraculously, the victim survived, but the motive was utterly chilling. This wasn't an act of personal anger or a playground dispute escalated. It was a murder attempted to appease a completely fictional character, a stark and horrifying example of how a shared fantasy can warp a child's perception of reality to the point of unspeakable violence. This tragic blurring of lines between fiction and reality finds a strange, dark echo in the world of collectibles and fandom, though with a motive rooted in tangible greed rather than ethereal belief. Just a few years ago, in 2021, a dispute erupted between two men in Florida. The subject wasn't land or money, but a piece of illustrated cardboard, a rare Charizard Pokémon card. What began as a trade negotiation with an estimated value of around $50 escalated into a heated argument. For one of the men involved, the perceived value of this card, a symbol of a cherished childhood franchise, outweighed reason, civility, and ultimately the value of a human life. He allegedly produced a firearm and shot and killed the other man over the disagreement. A life was extinguished for a possession that, outside of its specific niche community, holds no inherent worth. This case forces us to confront how a passion for collecting, for holding onto a piece of nostalgia, can become so dangerously distorted that it justifies murder in someone's mind. Both stories, though vastly different, reveal a profound and unsettling truth. The human capacity for attachment, whether to a digital myth or a physical token of a fantasy world, can sometimes override our most fundamental morals. From the realm of childhood fantasy and collectible card games, we now venture into the shadowy intersection of supposed supernatural forces and cold, calculated greed. Our next two cases showcase motives that are bizarre not for their childishness, but for the elaborate, almost theatrical beliefs that were used to justify murder. First, we travel back to 1981 in Brookfield, Connecticut, for a case that sounds like it's ripped from a horror movie, because it eventually was. Arne Cheyenne Johnson stood trial for the murder of his landlord, Alan Bono. The stabbing itself was brutal and straightforward, but the defense Johnson's lawyers mounted was anything but. They argued that Johnson was not guilty by reason of demonic possession. This unprecedented legal strategy was born from a series of events involving the Glatzel family. Johnson's fiancé's younger brother, David Glatzel, had allegedly become possessed after the family moved into a new home. The Warrens, the famous paranormal investigators, were even called in. During an exorcism, the story goes, Johnson allegedly taunted the demon, challenging it to leave the boy and come into him instead. Shortly thereafter, he killed Bono. The court, unsurprisingly, did not accept the possession defense, and Johnson was convicted of first-degree manslaughter. The motive here is a labyrinth of belief. Whether one sees it as a genuine, terrifying spiritual occurrence or a meticulously constructed lie, it remains one of the only times in American legal history where the defense attempted to argue that the devil made them do it. This notion of an external, almost mythical force driving someone to kill stands in stark contrast to our next case, where the motive was terrifyingly earthly, the belief in a financial curse. In 2012, Abraham Shakespeare, a humble truck driver's assistant from Florida, had his life transformed when he won a $30 million lottery jackpot. Rather than a blessing, this windfall became the source of his demise. Shakespeare was a generous man, often giving money to friends and strangers who sought him out with hard luck stories. This generosity made him a target. A woman named D.D. Moore insinuated herself into his life, presenting herself as a financial advisor who wanted to help him write a book about his experience. In reality, she believed his money was a curse upon him, a curse that she could lift by taking it for herself. She systematically isolated him, gained control of his remaining assets, and then, when he had nothing left to give, she murdered him and buried his body beneath a concrete slab in her backyard. Moore's motive wasn't just robbery, it was a warped sense of entitlement, a belief that she was somehow saving him from the burden of his wealth by transferring every last penny and his very life to herself. Leaving behind the high stakes of demonic claims and life-altering lotteries, we descend into the utterly mundane, the everyday irritations that for most of us are just minor frustrations. It's here, in the realm of the trivial, that some of the most bewildering motives for murder take root. How could a cherished family recipe or a simple lack of sleep escalate into fatal violence? The answers reveal a terrifying fragility in the human psyche when confronted with seemingly insignificant provocations. Our first case takes us to Texas in 2013, to a dispute that began with the promise of a sweet, refreshing drink and ended in tragedy. Elaine Boehmer and her friend Laura Jean Mock were not just acquaintances, they were close enough that Boehmer had shared her family's prized secret recipe for lemonade. This wasn't your standard mix of powder and water. It was a cherished heirloom passed down through generations, a symbol of family identity and trust. The conflict ignited when Boehmer believed Mock had violated that sacred trust by preparing the lemonade for other people. An argument erupted between the two women, a verbal firestorm over the ownership of a recipe, a list of ingredients and instructions. This war of words tragically escalated from a disagreement over intellectual property to physical violence. Mock was brutally stabbed to death. Her life ended over a formula for lemonade. The motive here transcends a simple argument. It speaks to a profound sense of betrayal over something that was deeply personal. For Boehmer, that recipe wasn't just about citrus and sugar. It was a piece of her family's soul, and its unauthorized use was an offense that, in her mind, justified an unforgivable response. If a lemonade recipe represents a violation of a personal, almost sacred boundary, our next case involves the violation of one of our most fundamental physical boundaries, the right to peace and quiet within our own homes. In 2009, in a New York apartment building, a man named Michael Andrade was driven to the absolute brink of sanity by a force he felt powerless to stop: his neighbor's incessant, thunderous snoring. For years, the walls between his apartment and that of his neighbor, David Gels, proved to be no barrier against the nightly cacophony. Andrade, suffering from severe sleep deprivation, reportedly tried everything. He pleaded with Gels, he complained to building management, and he even resorted to pounding on the walls in a futile attempt to silence the noise that was systematically destroying his mental health. This wasn't a minor annoyance. Chronic sleep deprivation is a form of torture that erodes judgment, amplifies anger, and dismantles self-control. One night, the constant grating sound pushed him past his breaking point. Andrade confronted Gels, and in a fit of rage fueled by years of exhaustion and exasperation, he stabbed him to death. The motive here wasn't hatred for the man, but a desperate, violent need to silence the noise that had come to symbolize his own torment. He wasn't just killing his neighbor, he was attempting to murder the source of his agony, a tragic testament to how an untreated medical condition and poor building insulation can combine with human frailty to create an unthinkable outcome. The fragility of the human ego can be a terrifyingly volatile element, especially when faced with what it perceives as the ultimate rejection or an unjust punishment. Our next two cases delve into this dark psychological territory, where a refusal of a future together and the removal of a virtual escape triggered responses of catastrophic and fatal violence. In 2018, in Montgomery County, Maryland, a man named Scott Simonti invited his girlfriend, Malin Leon, to what she believed was a simple dinner date. Instead, it became a stage for a life-altering question. Simonti presented Leon with a marriage proposal. When she declined, the evening shattered. For Simonti, this rejection was not merely a romantic disappointment. It was a profound personal insult, a dismantling of his envisioned future. This perceived humiliation festered into a rage that he could not contain. Just days later, he armed himself, went to the nursing home where Malin Leon worked as a nurse, and shot her to death before turning the gun on himself. The motive here is a stark and chilling example of a possessive and entitled mindset warping into lethal action. His reaction suggests a belief that if he could not have the life with her that he wanted, then no one could. It was a tragic, final act of control in the face of a reality he refused to accept, a life extinguished for the simple, human act of saying no. This theme of an explosive reaction to a denied desire finds a disturbing parallel in the digital world, though the context shifts from romantic entitlement to a deep, almost pathological immersion in a virtual reality. In 2007, in the quiet community of Albuquerque, New Mexico, a 15-year-old boy named Alex Pilsner was a dedicated player of the massively popular online game World of Warcraft. For many, such games are a hobby, but for Alex, it had become his primary social outlet and identity. When his parents, concerned about his behavior and falling grades, did what countless parents have done, they took the game away as a form of punishment. They unknowingly triggered a cataclysm. In Alex's mind, they weren't just removing a source of entertainment. They were severing his connection to his friends, his achievements, and his entire digital life. The perceived injustice of this punishment, the isolation he felt, boiled over into an uncontrollable fury. He retrieved his father's caliber rifle and shot his mother, Carolyn Pilsner, multiple times, killing her. He then laid in wait for his father, Paul, to return home from work, ambushing and murdering him as well. The motive here transcends simple anger over a lost privilege. It was a devastating rage quit from reality itself, a violent lashing out against the people who controlled the gateway to the world where he felt he truly belonged. This case remains a sobering lesson in the potent, and sometimes dangerously underestimated, power of virtual worlds to shape a young person's perception and priorities. If the theft of a recipe or the sound of snoring can push someone over the edge, consider the potent combination of territorial pride and sudden, explosive rage. In the summer of 2018, in the Bronx, New York, a dispute began over a commodity so fiercely guarded in urban life, a parking space. 35-year-old Jason Wright had just finished his shift as a building superintendent and was attempting to park his car in a spot near his apartment building. Unbeknownst to him, a 32-year-old mother named Tishona Rodriguez had already placed a traffic cone in that spot, a common urban practice to reserve a space she had presumably cleared of snow or simply felt entitled to. An argument erupted, a confrontation over a few square feet of asphalt. For Wright, this was likely the final frustration in a long, hard day. The verbal clash escalated with terrifying speed into physical violence, and Wright produced a knife, stabbing Rodriguez multiple times in the chest. She was pronounced dead at the hospital. The motive here is a stark study in how a momentary conflict, fueled by a sense of entitlement to public property and an inability to de-escalate, can shatter lives in an instant. A child was left without a mother, and a man faced a murder charge all over the right to park a car. This frightening immediacy of violence, sparked by a fleeting argument over something as trivial as a parking spot, stands in dramatic contrast to a murder motive that was not impulsive but was instead steeped in a terrifying, premeditated belief system. We travel back to 1990 in the suburban community of Lantana, Florida, to the story of 23-year-old Michael Patrick Pernis. His parents had become increasingly concerned about his mental state and his deep immersion in the occult. In a desperate attempt to help their son, they ironically took him to see a psychic, hoping for some form of guidance or clarity. This decision would have fatal consequences. The psychic he consulted allegedly provided a chilling diagnosis. She told Pernis that his parents were not who they seemed. They were, she claimed, possessed by demonic forces and were a direct threat to his life. This external validation from a figure he perceived as an authority on the unseen world solidified his darkest fears into a perceived reality. Acting on this prophecy, Pernis armed himself with a shotgun. He first shot his father, 50-year-old Michael Pernis Sr., as he sat watching television. He then waited for his mother, 47-year-old Nancy Pernis, to return home from work, ambushing and killing her in their garage. His defense, not guilty by reason of insanity, citing the psychic's influence. The court, however, found him guilty of first-degree murder, deciding he could distinguish right from wrong despite the bizarre motive. This case forces us to confront the immense power of suggestion and the vulnerability of a disturbed mind, showing how a few words from a supposed mystic can be twisted into a justification for the ultimate betrayal. The human capacity for conflict over the seemingly insignificant is a thread that runs through many of these bizarre cases. We've seen lives ended over parking spots and lemonade, but what happens when that trivial spark is combined with the pressures of modern consumer culture? In the summer of 2019, a perfect storm of marketing hype and impulsive rage culminated in a tragedy outside a Popeyes restaurant in Oxon Hill, Maryland. The fast food chain had just launched its new chicken sandwich, and the demand was nothing short of a cultural phenomenon. Lines of cars snaked through the drive-thru, and crowds gathered inside, all hoping to get a taste of the viral sensation. It was within this pressurized environment, fueled by hunger and impatience, that a simple disagreement between two customers in line escalated with terrifying speed. The exact nature of the argument remains unclear, but witnesses described a sudden physical altercation. In a matter of moments, 28-year-old Kevin Tyrell Davis allegedly drew a firearm and shot and killed 22-year-old Kevin Joseph. A young man's life was extinguished, and a community was left reeling, all over a place in a queue for a fast food chicken sandwich. The motive here is a chilling commentary on how consumer fervor and the frustration of waiting can short-circuit basic civility. transforming a shared experience into a deadly competition for a product that was, in the end, just a meal. If the Popeyes case represents a conflict born from a momentary, crowd-fueled pressure cooker, our next story reveals how a predictable, recurring nuisance can slowly erode a neighborly relationship until it snaps. In 2016, in the small town of Mount Pleasant, Pennsylvania, 59-year-old David Sumney was a man of routine. He liked to start his Saturdays early, and part of that routine involved mowing his lawn at what he considered a reasonable hour. For his neighbor, 43-year-old Michael Shomo, however, the sound of the lawnmower was an unbearable intrusion on his peace and sleep. This was not a one-time complaint, it was a long-standing point of friction between the two men. On this particular Saturday morning, the grating noise proved to be the final straw. Shomo, reportedly enraged, marched over to Sumney's property. Instead of another verbal argument, he was armed with a caliber revolver. He confronted Sumney on his own lawn and, without any apparent further provocation, shot him multiple times, killing him. Shomo then callously returned to his own home, leaving his neighbor dead beside the lawnmower. The motive is almost absurd in its simplicity. A man was murdered for the crime of maintaining his yard too early on a weekend. It underscores a profound failure to manage anger and resolve disputes, where the solution to an auditory annoyance became permanent, violent silence. The value we assign to objects, especially those tied to our hobbies and identities, can sometimes reach a truly illogical zenith, a theme we've seen before but one that finds a particularly poignant and tragic expression in the world of competitive gaming. In 2015, in the town of Marysville, Washington, a 15-year-old boy named Jake Gravbrot was an avid player of the complex fantasy card game Magic: The Gathering. For its enthusiasts, the game is more than a pastime. It's a deep strategic pursuit, and the cards themselves can hold significant monetary value. Gravbrot owned a rare card known as a Bitter Blossom, a powerful asset in gameplay that was also worth several $100s. When this prized card went missing, he became convinced that his friend and fellow player, 17-year-old Chase Hart, had stolen it. This wasn't just a simple accusation between acquaintances. It was a breach of trust within a shared community, a violation of the unwritten rules among gamers. The perceived theft festered in Gravbrot's mind, transforming a friend into a thief and a piece of cardboard into a justification for ultimate retribution. He confronted Hart at the younger boy's home, and the argument escalated into a physical fight. Gravbrot produced a knife and stabbed Hart to death. The motive here is a devastating escalation of grievance, where the loss of a game piece, a token of fantasy conflict, was used to rationalize a very real and fatal act of violence. It's a sobering reminder of how the lines between a cherished hobby and grim reality can become catastrophically blurred. This deep-seated passion for the right way of doing something, whether it's playing a game or simply preparing a meal, can sometimes ignite conflicts with a ferocity that is completely disproportionate to the issue at hand. In 2004, in Cleveland, Ohio, two brothers were enjoying a classic American summer activity, a family barbecue. 42-year-old Michael Weimer was grilling hamburgers for the gathering, a seemingly simple and joyful task. His brother, 45-year-old Patrick Weimer, however, took issue with Michael's cooking technique. An argument erupted over the grill, a heated debate about the correct way to cook a hamburger. To an outside observer, the subject of the dispute could not be more mundane, but within the dynamic of their relationship, this culinary criticism became a profound point of contention. The war of words grew more and more intense, fueled perhaps by long-standing sibling rivalry and the heat of the moment. The verbal clash turned physical, and in the struggle, Michael Weimer produced a handgun and shot his older brother Patrick in the chest, killing him. The motive here is almost jarring in its absurd simplicity. A man was killed over a difference of opinion on burger preparation. It strips away any pretense of a grand, understandable reason for violence, leaving only the naked, terrifying truth that a momentary spike in anger, triggered by the most trivial of disagreements, can irrevocably destroy a family in an instant. This journey into the darkest corners of human motivation now brings us to two cases where the catalyst for violence was not a prized possession or a deeply held belief, but something far more ephemeral, a digital connection and a moment of convenience. These stories reveal how the tools and trivialities of modern life can become twisted into fatal flashpoints. In 2009, the social media landscape was still relatively new, and the intricacies of online relationships were not yet fully understood. In the small town of Myrtle, Missouri, 40-year-old Shirley Skinner was a mother deeply invested in her teenage daughter's social world. When her daughter had a falling out with a friend, 51-year-old Pamela Bull, the dispute played out in the digital arena. Bull, feeling slighted, took the modern action of digitally severing the tie. She unfriended Skinner's daughter on Facebook. To most, this would be a minor act of social friction, a silent signal of a cooled friendship. But to Shirley Skinner, it was perceived as a profound and public insult against her child. This digital snub festered, blurring the lines between her daughter's social life and her own sense of maternal honor. She drove to Bull's home, and what began as a confrontation over a social media action quickly escalated into a physical altercation. Skinner, armed with a gun, shot Bull multiple times, killing her. The motive here is a stark examination of how the new language of online interaction, an unfriend, was violently translated into the old language of mortal conflict. It was a lethal overreaction to a perceived social slight, a tragic demonstration of how a click on a screen could be misinterpreted as a declaration of war worthy of a fatal response. If the Facebook case represents a violent overreaction to a new form of social rejection, our next story is a chillingly simple testament to how little it can take to shatter a domestic peace. In 1993, in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, two roommates, 40-year-old Lawrence McMillian and 35-year-old Donald Jackson, were relaxing in their shared apartment watching television. This mundane scene of coexistence turned deadly over the most basic of household objects, the remote control. A disagreement erupted over which program to watch, a common enough spat in shared living spaces. But for these two men, this trivial argument over channel selection escalated with shocking speed from a war of words to a physical struggle for possession of the plastic device. In the heat of the fight, McMillian retrieved a handgun and shot Jackson in the chest, killing him. The motive is almost breathtaking in its absurd simplicity. A man lost his life not over a deeply personal betrayal or a significant valuable, but over momentary control of a television set. It underscores a terrifying lack of impulse control and a complete failure to de-escalate, where the immediate gratification of choosing entertainment was valued more than the life of the person sharing the room. It stands as one of the purest examples of a motive so trivial that it defies any attempt to find deeper meaning, leaving only the stark, unsettling fact of a life ended for nothing. The fragile ego, when bruised by social rejection, can sometimes fracture in the most devastating ways, a theme tragically illustrated in a Texas high school in 1991. 16-year-old Jonathan Miller had worked up the courage to ask a fellow student, 14-year-old Amy Dearlum, to be his date for the homecoming dance. When she politely declined his invitation, Miller did not simply experience the typical teenage sting of rejection. For him, this personal refusal was a catastrophic blow to his self-worth, a public humiliation that he felt he could not endure. The following day, he arrived at Round Rock High School armed with a caliber revolver. He walked up to Amy between classes and in a crowded hallway full of students, raised the weapon and shot her in the head at point-blank range, killing her instantly. The motive here was not a complex, long-simmering hatred, but a violent, instantaneous eruption of wounded pride. He wasn't just killing the girl who said no, he was attempting to destroy the source of his profound shame, a chilling overreaction that highlights how perilously thin the line can be between adolescent insecurity and homicidal rage in a troubled mind. This dangerous intertwining of personal identity with external validation finds a bizarre and fatal parallel in the world of professional sports fandom, where tribal loyalty can override all sense of perspective and friendship. In 2012, in East Rutherford, New Jersey, a gathering of friends to watch a football game descended into unimaginable violence. 37-year-old Michael Bexella and 25-year-old Michael Giuliano were longtime friends, united by their shared passion for New York football. Their alliance, however, fractured along team lines. Bexella was a dedicated Giants fan, while Giuliano cheered for the Jets. As the game unfolded and alcohol flowed, a heated debate over which team was truly superior escalated from good-natured ribbing into a vicious personal argument. The passion each man held for his chosen team became conflated with his own personal pride. What began as a dispute over athletes and statistics transformed into a perceived attack on individual judgment and loyalty. In a fit of rage, Bexella grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed his friend Giuliano multiple times, killing him. The motive here is a stark, almost absurd testament to how a manufactured rivalry between two sports franchises can be internalized to such a degree that it justifies murdering a friend. A lifelong bond was severed forever over a disagreement that, in the cold light of day, meant absolutely nothing. The relentless strain of a persistent, everyday nuisance can slowly poison a relationship between neighbors, creating a pressure cooker of resentment that eventually explodes. This was the tragic reality for 50-year-old David Munoz and his neighbor, 52-year-old Jose Velasquez, in a quiet California neighborhood in 2008. For years, Munoz had owned a dog that, by all accounts, was a prolific barker. The constant, intrusive noise became the soundtrack to Velasquez's life, a source of unending frustration that eroded his peace and ultimately his sanity. He had repeatedly complained to Munoz and to local authorities, but the barking continued. This wasn't a single, explosive argument over a loud party. It was a slow-burning war of attrition fought over the fidelity of a fence line. One October evening, the familiar sound proved to be the final straw. Velasquez pushed past his breaking point, confronted Munoz in his driveway. The argument quickly escalated, and Velasquez, armed with a knife, stabbed his neighbor to death. The motive here is a horrifying testament to how an untreated problem, a disruptive pet, and a failure to find a peaceful resolution can fester into an all-consuming hatred, where the only solution seems to be the permanent silencing of the source. This grim reality of a motive born from years of accumulated irritation stands in stark contrast to a case where the inspiration for violence was not rooted in the real world at all, but in a fictional, digital one. Just a few years prior, in 2003, the small town of Fayetteville, Tennessee, was rocked by a crime that seemed to have been ripped from a screen. Two stepbrothers, 16-year-old Josh Buck and 17-year-old William Buck, embarked on a crime spree that included theft, arson, and finally, murder. Their target was a 45-year-old neighbor, Aaron Hamel, who was simply driving to a prayer meeting when the brothers, riding in a stolen car, opened fire on his vehicle with a caliber rifle, killing him instantly. When apprehended, their explanation was as shocking as the crime itself. They claimed they were inspired by and attempting to emulate the ultra-violent actions of the protagonist in the wildly popular video game Grand Theft Auto 3. They stated that the game, which rewards players for committing criminal acts within its open world, had effectively made them do it, blurring the lines between fantasy and reality to a catastrophic degree. While the game didn't directly pull the trigger, it provided a script for violence, a framework where mayhem was not only possible but rewarded. Their motive was a desire to live out the dangerous fantasy they had repeatedly consumed, a chilling example of how immersive media can potentially warp the judgment of vulnerable individuals, providing a warped justification for unimaginable acts. Even the most basic neighborly request can take a dark and unexpected turn when met with hostility. In 2010, in the city of Saginaw, Michigan, 44-year-old Kimberly Goyne found herself in a common domestic situation. She was baking and realized she was out of a key ingredient. She walked next door to the home of her 52-year-old neighbor, Pamela Rewers, to ask if she could borrow a single cup of sugar. This simple act of community, a scenario that plays out countless times without incident, somehow ignited a fiery argument between the two women. The details of what was said remain locked within that moment, but the confrontation became so heated and vitriolic that it escalated far beyond words. Rewers, in a fit of rage, retrieved a firearm and shot Goyne multiple times, killing her. The motive here is almost incomprehensible in its origins. A life was ended not over a long-standing feud or a significant betrayal, but over a request for a common baking staple. It suggests a pre-existing, seething resentment that was just waiting for a spark, any spark, to ignite it. The borrowed cup of sugar was not the cause, but merely the catalyst that unleashed a torrent of pent-up anger with fatal consequences. This theme of a minor social infraction sparking a disproportionate and deadly response finds a grim parallel in the delicate, often performative codes of conduct that can govern social spaces like bars. In 2007, in a bar in West Palm Beach, Florida, a simple accident became a matter of fatal pride. 24-year-old Daniel Malave was socializing when he accidentally bumped into another patron, 34-year-old Michael Rafferty, causing Rafferty's drink to spill. In the unwritten etiquette of such environments, the expected response is a quick apology and an offer to replace the lost beverage. Malave, however, refused to acknowledge the accident or offer any form of amends. This perceived disrespect, this refusal to adhere to the social contract of the bar, was taken as a grave insult by Rafferty. The spilled drink itself was trivial, the insult to his pride was anything but. The argument that ensued was fierce and immediate. For Rafferty, the only suitable response to this public humiliation was violence. He produced a knife and stabbed Malave in the chest, killing him. The motive in this case was not about the value of the cocktail, but the immense value placed on saving face. It was a lethal enforcement of a warped sense of honor, where a man was killed for failing to say two simple words, "I'm sorry." Even the shared experience of entertainment, something meant to bring people together, can sometimes fracture under the weight of a strong opinion. In 1998, in the town of Arlington Heights, Illinois, two lifelong friends, 35-year-old James Degorski and 34-year-old Michael Piacenza, were relaxing after watching the big-budget Hollywood blockbuster Armageddon. The film, centered on a team of oil drillers sent to destroy an asteroid heading for Earth, concludes with a deeply emotional, sacrificial ending. For most viewers, it's a moment of cinematic catharsis. For these two friends, it became the subject of a furious debate. Their argument over the film's conclusion, specifically, the logic and emotional impact of the main character's fate, escalated from a simple difference of opinion into a shouting match. The passion each man held for his interpretation of the movie's finale became intensely personal, as if criticizing the plot was a criticism of the viewer's own judgment. This war of words tragically spilled out of the living room and into the physical world. The verbal clash turned into a shoving match, which then escalated into a full-blown fistfight. In the brutal struggle, Degorski allegedly struck Piacenza, causing him to fall and hit his head on a sharp corner of a table with fatal force. A man lost his life because he and his best friend could not see eye to eye on the artistic merits of a summer action movie. The motive here is a stark examination of how a shared cultural moment, intended for enjoyment, can become a fatal battleground when ego and inflexibility override friendship and reason. This catastrophic failure to navigate a disagreement finds a dark and ironic mirror in a case where the subject of the conflict was not a fictional outcome, but a very real and sudden change in fortune. Just over a decade later, in 2009, in the Bronx, New York, two brothers found themselves on the opposite side of a life-altering windfall. 53-year-old Joseph Lopez and his 49-year-old brother Ramon Lopez had done what many siblings and friends do. They had gone in together to purchase a $1 scratch-off lottery ticket. This time, their small investment paid off, not a massive jackpot, but a still significant prize of $1,000. What should have been a moment of celebration and easy division, $500 each, instantly curdled into a bitter dispute. An argument erupted over how to fairly split the winnings, with the disagreement apparently rooted in who had actually provided the dollar for the ticket. The war of words between the two brothers grew more and more heated, fueled by a potent mix of sudden greed and long-standing familial tensions. For Joseph, the perceived injustice of the proposed split was an affront he could not abide. In a rage, he armed himself with a knife and stabbed his own brother to death over the disagreement. The motive here transcends simple greed. It's a tragic story of how a symbol of potential joy, a winning lottery ticket, can become a catalyst for revealing the deepest resentments in a relationship. A brotherly bond was severed forever for a share of money that, in the end, amounted to a few $100s. Beyond the clashes over films and fortune, we enter a realm where the motive for murder defies not just social norms, but the very boundaries of consensus reality itself. In 1997, in the town of Brookhaven, Mississippi, 38-year-old Derek Todd Lee, a name that would later become infamous for other reasons, claimed an otherworldly compulsion for a horrific act. After stabbing his wife and two young children to death, he presented a defense that was as shocking as the crime. He told investigators that he had been under the control of extraterrestrial beings who had abducted him and implanted a device in his brain. These alien entities, he claimed, had given him a direct and inescapable command. He must kill his family. While this defense was ultimately rejected and Lee was found guilty, the motive he professed remains one of the most bizarre in the annals of American crime. It forces us to confront the terrifying power of a delusion so complete that it can override the most fundamental human instinct to protect one's own children, transforming a man into a weapon for a fiction only he could see. This descent into a world of hallucinatory command stands in stark, almost absurd contrast to a case where the dispute was not over intergalactic instructions, but over a place to rest one's feet. In 2014, in the city of Macon, Georgia, a family gathered for a festive summer barbecue. It was a scene of familiar relaxation, complete with coolers, grills, and a collection of folding lawn chairs. The tragic conflict began when 44-year-old Antonio Williams arrived and found his usual chair occupied by another guest. A seemingly minor argument ensued over the seating arrangement, a dispute over territorial rights to a specific piece of canvas and aluminum. For the men involved, this was not a trivial matter. It was a challenge to their status and comfort within the social hierarchy of the gathering. The war of words quickly escalated, and Williams, feeling disrespected, left the scene only to return moments later armed with a pistol. He opened fire, striking and killing 51-year-old Anthony Johnson. In an instant, a celebration of family and community was shattered by violence sparked by the most mundane of domestic disagreements. The motive here is a chilling study in how a perceived slight over something as insignificant as a chair can be inflated into a matter of lethal honor, revealing how fragile social bonds can be when pride is put before peace. Even within the solemn and sacred context of a funeral, a place meant for collective mourning and support, the sting of romantic rejection can fester into a homicidal rage. In 2015, in Cleveland, Ohio, 34-year-old Zane Seals had developed an infatuation with 26-year-old Shalissa Slack. When she did not reciprocate his feelings, his attraction warped into a dangerous obsession. The situation reached its tragic climax at the most inappropriate of venues, the funeral for Slack's grandmother. As Slack and her family gathered to grieve their loss, Seals approached her, seemingly to offer condolences. Instead, he used the moment to confront her once more about her rejection of him. In a place dedicated to honoring a life that had ended, Seals chose to violently extinguish another. He drew a firearm and shot Slack multiple times in front of her horrified family and friends, murdering her before fleeing the scene. The motive here is a chilling amplification of the familiar theme of entitlement. Seals felt so irrevocably wronged by her refusal that he violated the ultimate sanctuary of grief to enact his revenge, ensuring that her family would now have 2 funerals to attend instead of 1. This catastrophic inability to process rejection, to accept a simple no, stands in stark contrast to a motive born not from romantic entitlement, but from a warped sense of honor and secrecy within the world of adolescent gaming. Just a few years earlier, in 2008, in the town of Port St. Lucie, Florida, 2 teenage friends were immersed in the popular first-person shooter game Halo 3. For 16-year-old Matthew Scheming and his 15-year-old friend, the intricate mechanics and hidden shortcuts of the game were a serious business. The argument began when Scheming believed his friend had broken a sacred code of conduct among gamers. He had shared a valuable cheat code with other players, thereby diminishing its exclusive advantage. This perceived betrayal over a digital secret escalated from a heated argument into a physical fight. In a fit of rage over this violation of gamer ethics, Scheming retrieved a handgun and shot his friend in the chest, killing him. The motive transcends a simple argument. It was a lethal enforcement of a juvenile pact, where the sanctity of a video game secret was valued more highly than the life of a friend. It's a devastating reminder of how the intense, all-consuming nature of competitive gaming can distort priorities, turning a virtual rulebook into a justification for very real and irreversible violence. Even the solemn rituals intended to bring closure and order can become stages for the most base and violent human impulses. In 2003, in a quiet California suburb, a family gathered for the reading of their father's will. This should have been a moment of unity, a final act of their patriarch meant to provide for his children and settle his affairs. But for 52-year-old Daniel Perez and his sister, 49-year-old Ana Perez, the document did not bring peace. Instead, it ignited a firestorm of resentment and perceived injustice over the distribution of assets. The precise nature of the disparity is less important than the reaction it provoked. For Daniel, the will's terms felt like a profound personal slight, a final judgment from beyond the grave that favored his sister. What began as a heated debate over legal phrasing and fairness rapidly spiraled into a screaming match right there in the attorney's office. The raw emotion of the moment, compounded by the grief of their recent loss, stripped away all civility. The argument spilled out into the parking lot, where it reached its horrifying climax. In a blinding rage, Daniel Perez attacked his sister, beating her with such ferocity that she died from her injuries. A ceremony meant to honor a life and follow a loved one's last wishes instead became the catalyst for a brother to murder his own sister, all over the division of possessions their father no longer needed. This tragic inability to share, to accept a division of resources, even one dictated by the dead, finds a grim and almost farcically trivial counterpart in a dispute over a shared meal. Just a few years later, in 2011, in a Maryland apartment, a common, almost universal modern scenario played out with fatal consequences. 2 roommates, 23-year-old Dane Hall and 21-year-old Danish Major, had ordered a pizza. As the pie was consumed, a single slice remained. This ordinary moment of indecision, who would get the last piece, escalated with shocking speed from a verbal squabble into a physical struggle. For these two young men, that final slice was not merely food. It became a symbol of victory, a matter of pride and possession in their shared living space. The argument grew so heated that Hall retrieved a knife and stabbed his roommate Major multiple times, killing him. The motive here is stunning in its simplicity. A young man lost his life over a piece of pizza worth a few dollars, a chilling testament to how a momentary refusal to yield, to simply let a trivial matter go, can escalate into irreversible violence when combined with pride and poor impulse control. One life ended and another ruined, all for the right to claim the last slice. This terrifying descent into a hallucinatory reality, where a man believed he was fighting for survival in a world overrun by the undead, stands as one of the most visually shocking and medically bizarre motives in modern history. In May of 2012, on the MacArthur Causeway in Miami, Florida, 31-year-old Ruddy Eugene attacked 65-year-old Ronald Popo, a homeless man who was simply resting near the roadway. The attack was not a standard assault, it was a sustained, cannibalistic frenzy. Eugene, reportedly under the devastating influence of a synthetic drug known as bath salts, which can induce extreme paranoia, psychosis, and superhuman strength, had stripped Popo naked and was savagely beating him before ultimately kneeling down and chewing off nearly 80% of the man's face. When police officers arrived on the scene and ordered Eugene to stop, he merely looked up, growled like an animal, and continued his gruesome assault, forcing an officer to open fire and kill him. The motive, as pieced together from his behavior and the known effects of the drug, was a complete break from reality. Eugene was not operating in our world. He was a character in his own horrific nightmare, one where he likely believed Popo was a zombie that needed to be destroyed. This case became a national sensation, not just for its sheer brutality, but for the way it highlighted the dangerous and unpredictable power of designer drugs to create a motive that exists entirely within a fractured mind. The chaotic, drug-fueled nightmare of the Miami Causeway presents a motive born from a complete detachment from reality, a stark contrast to our next case, where the conflict was intensely focused on the shared, mundane reality of a workplace environment. In 2017, in the city of Austin, Texas, two co-workers were assigned to a job installing floors at a local residence. For many, listening to music is a way to pass the time and make manual labor more enjoyable, a simple pleasure. But on this day, the choice of soundtrack became a matter of fatal disagreement. 23-year-old Michael Acker and his 40-year-old co-worker, Michael Ingram, had differing tastes, and a dispute erupted over control of the music playlist. What began as a simple argument over musical preference quickly escalated into a heated shouting match. For Acker, the issue was clearly more than just the music. It was about control, respect, and his ability to dictate the environment in which he worked. Unable to resolve the conflict through words, he made the catastrophic decision to retrieve a handgun from his vehicle. He returned to the home and shot Ingram multiple times, killing him. The motive here is almost absurd in its simplicity when weighed against the ultimate outcome. A man lost his life because his co-worker could not tolerate listening to a genre of music he disliked. It underscores how the pressure cooker environment of a job site, combined with a failure to manage frustration and an easy access to firearms, can transform the most trivial of disagreements into a permanent, violent silence. A life was ended over a difference in musical taste, a chilling reminder that for some, being right is worth more than another person's right to live. And now we arrive at a case that is perhaps the most tragic of all, not for its sheer bizarre nature, but for its devastating clarity and the global reckoning it provoked. It's a motive that simultaneously feels like the most trivial and the most profound on our list. In May of 2020, in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a 46-year-old man named George Floyd purchased a pack of cigarettes from a local convenience store. The store clerk, believing the $20 bill used in the transaction was counterfeit, contacted the police. This was a minor, non-violent, alleged economic offense, the type of incident that, for most, would result in nothing more than a fine or a citation, if it was even pursued at all. Yet, when police officers arrived on the scene, this simple allegation became the catalyst for a horrifying chain of events. Officer Derek Chauvin and his colleagues confronted Floyd, who was sitting in his car. What followed was not a measured response to a low-level complaint, but a brutal and prolonged restraint. For 9 minutes and 29 seconds, Chauvin knelt on Floyd's neck and back as he lay handcuffed face down on the pavement, ignoring his repeated pleas of "I can't breathe" and the growing concern of horrified bystanders. Floyd was not resisting, he was dying, and the world was watching the video captured on a smartphone. The official motive for this initial police encounter, the investigation of a possibly fake $20 bill, was so staggeringly insignificant when weighed against the lethal force employed. It laid bare a terrifying disconnect, a perception that a black man's life could be deemed so disposable over such a minor suspected infraction. George Floyd's murder was not bizarre in the sense of being rooted in fantasy or a trivial quarrel between equals. Its profound strangeness, its shocking absurdity, lay in the grotesque and fatal overreach of authority it represented. A life was extinguished over the suspected authenticity of a piece of currency, an act that would ignite a global firestorm of protest against police brutality and systemic racism, transforming a single, tragic death into a symbol for a movement demanding that all lives be valued far more than $20. These tragic tales, from spilt drinks to disputed parking spots, force us to confront a deeply unsettling psychological question. How does the human mind bridge the vast chasm between a minor irritation and the decision to end a life? The answer lies not in the triviality of the trigger itself, but in the profound psychological meaning the individual assigns to it. A parking space isn't just a patch of asphalt. For the person who feels entitled to it, it becomes a symbol of their standing, a challenge to their authority that must be met with force to save face. A rejected marriage proposal isn't just a romantic disappointment. For a fragile ego, it can feel like a total annihilation of self-worth, a humiliation so profound that it demands a violent reassertion of control. The bizarre motive is often just the visible tip of an enormous iceberg of underlying psychological issues, deep-seated insecurity, pathological entitlement, or a festering reservoir of untreated rage. At the core of many of these escalations is the concept of an ego threat. When someone perceives a slight, whether it's being unfriended on social media or criticized for their grilling technique, they aren't just reacting to the action itself. They are reacting to the perceived message behind it, a challenge to their competence, their status, or their value as a person. For an individual already struggling with narcissistic traits or a fragile sense of self, this perceived attack can feel existentially threatening. The rational mind, which might normally de-escalate the situation, is effectively hijacked by the limbic system, the brain's emotional center. This triggers a fight or flight response, but in these confined, interpersonal conflicts, flight isn't an option they consider. The only response becomes fight, a disproportionate, often lethal attempt to obliterate the source of the threat and restore a shattered sense of pride. This hijacking is compounded by a critical failure of impulse control. Each of us experiences flashes of anger or frustration, but most are equipped with a psychological brake system, the ability to pause, consider the consequences, and choose a non-violent path. In these cases, that brake system has utterly failed. This failure can be due to a multitude of factors: chronic sleep deprivation, as with the man driven mad by snoring, the influence of drugs or alcohol, which lower inhibitions, or underlying psychiatric conditions that impair judgment. The individual becomes a slave to the immediate, white-hot emotion of the moment. The long-term consequences, prison, the destruction of multiple lives, are completely invisible to them. All that exists is the overwhelming urge to strike out and the readily available means to do so. turning a momentary spike of rage into a permanent, irreversible catastrophe. Furthermore, these bizarre motives frequently reveal a catastrophic breakdown of rational thought, where normal cognitive processes are replaced by a distorted, personalized logic. The man who killed over a Pokémon card wasn't thinking about its objective market value. In that heated moment, the card represented his entire investment in a community and an identity, and the other man was threatening to take that away. The brothers who fought over a lottery ticket weren't just arguing over money. They were fighting over perceived fairness and years of unresolved sibling rivalry, with the ticket acting as a conduit for all that pent-up resentment. The brain, under stress, creates a narrative that justifies the violence, making it feel like a necessary, even righteous act to the perpetrator. This is why these motives can seem so illogical to outside observers. We are not privy to the intensely personal, distorted internal world in which the violence makes perfect sense. Ultimately, these stories serve as a chilling reminder of the delicate fabric of civility that holds society together. They show us that the line between a mundane disagreement and a mortal conflict is frighteningly thin, maintained only by our collective commitment to empathy, self-control, and rational conflict resolution. Each case is a tragedy in its own right, a life lost over something that should never have mattered more than a human life. But collectively, they form a compelling psychological study, urging us to look beyond the bizarre surface of the motive and recognize the universal human vulnerabilities, pride, fear, and rage, that when left unchecked can lead any of us to the unthinkable. When a murder motive seems to defy all logic, the courtroom becomes a battleground not just over facts, but over the very nature of reality and intent. Defense attorneys, faced with clients whose actions spring from reasons like a spilled drink or a belief in demonic possession, are tasked with constructing a narrative that a jury can somehow comprehend, even if they can never truly condone the act. The legal strategies employed in these cases often venture into uncharted territory, attempting to translate the bizarre into a framework of criminal responsibility. In the case of Arne Cheyenne Johnson, the so-called "devil made me do it" case, his legal team mounted a defense of demonic possession, a concept completely outside the bounds of established law. They weren't arguing he didn't do it, they were arguing he wasn't in control of his own body when he did. The court, unsurprisingly, rejected this argument, not because it ruled on the existence of demons, but because our legal system is built on the premise of personal responsibility. The defense failed because it couldn't fit a supernatural claim into a natural world legal structure, highlighting the immense challenge of using an otherworldly motive as a legal defense. This challenge of proving criminal intent, or mens rea, is the central hurdle in these bizarre cases. The prosecution must convince the jury that the defendant possessed the specific intent to kill, or at least a reckless disregard for life, even if the catalyst was trivial. The defense, conversely, often works to argue that the defendant's mental state was so fractured, so divorced from reality, that they could not have formed the necessary intent. This was the core of the argument for Michael Pernis, who killed his parents on the advice of a psychic. His lawyers argued that his belief in their demonic possession was so complete it constituted a form of insanity, preventing him from understanding the wrongfulness of his actions. The jury, however, convicted him, suggesting that they believed he knew it was wrong to kill, regardless of his strange beliefs. This illustrates the fine line courts walk. A bizarre motive might explain why someone did something, but it doesn't automatically excuse that they did it. The jury must peer into the mind of the defendant and decide if that motive, however absurd, still allowed for a conscious choice to commit violence. The perception of the jury is everything, and defense attorneys must carefully gauge how to present these motives without alienating the ordinary people in the jury box. An argument that might seem laughable on paper, like a murder over a lemonade recipe, has to be framed in terms of human emotion that jurors might understand, such as profound betrayal or a lifetime of built-up resentment. The attorney isn't asking the jury to agree that the recipe was worth killing for. They are asking them to understand that to the defendant in that heated moment, it represented something so valuable that their judgment was completely overwhelmed. This strategy aims to reduce the charge from premeditated murder to manslaughter, arguing that the killing was not planned but was a crime of passion provoked by a sudden, intense emotional disturbance. For the jury, the difficulty lies in separating their own logical assessment of the trigger from the defendant's illogical, emotional experience of it. They must ask themselves not, does this make sense to me, but could this have made sense to him in that state at that time? Ultimately, the courtroom drama surrounding these bizarre motives reveals a fascinating tension within the justice system. The law strives for objectivity, but it must be applied to the profoundly subjective and often irrational human mind. A jury might privately think a motive is the height of absurdity, but they are instructed to focus on the evidence of intent and state of mind. Cases like the World of Warcraft parricide or the Halo cheating murder force the legal system to grapple with modern realities, like the deep psychological impact of virtual worlds that existing statutes never anticipated. These trials become more than just a determination of guilt or innocence. They become a societal referendum on where we draw the line between explanation and excuse, between a reason that mitigates responsibility and one that simply confounds it. The verdicts send a message about what our society deems a comprehensible, if not justifiable, breaking point, and what it dismisses as a tempest in a teapot that could never warrant a lethal storm. These bizarre and tragic cases act as a funhouse mirror, distorting yet revealing uncomfortable truths about the society that produces them. They are not merely isolated acts of madness. They are extreme symptoms of broader cultural currents flowing through modern American life. When we examine them collectively, patterns emerge that speak to our relationship with possessions, our consumption of media, our inability to manage disagreement, and a dangerous strain of hyper-individualism. Consider our profound connection to materialism. The murders over a Pokémon card, a Magic the Gathering card, or even a disputed lottery ticket point to a culture where the value of objects can become dangerously inflated, often eclipsing the value of human connection. In a society saturated with consumerism, where identity is frequently tied to what we own, from the brands we wear to the collectibles we display, possessions cease to be mere things. They become extensions of ourselves. A challenge to our ownership or a threat to our coveted item is then perceived not as a simple dispute but as a personal attack. This isn't just about greed, it's about a world view where personal property is so deeply entwined with self-worth that its defense can feel like a fight for one's very identity, with tragically literal consequences. This is compounded by the powerful and often unexamined influence of media and pop culture. The Slender Man case and the Grand Theft Auto-inspired killing spree are not proof that video games or horror stories directly cause violence. Rather, they are stark warnings about what can happen when immersive fiction bleeds into a vulnerable mind lacking the critical framework to separate fantasy from reality. We live in an age of unprecedented media consumption, where narratives of power, violence, and supernatural command are endlessly streamed into our homes. For most, it's entertainment. For a fragile few, these stories can provide a script, a justification, or a warped sense of purpose. These cases force us to confront our collective responsibility. In creating such potent fictions, do we also bear a duty to better understand their impact on the most impressionable among us, and to foster media literacy that strengthens the line between play and reality? Furthermore, these crimes expose a startling erosion of conflict resolution skills. The parking space argument, the spilled drink, the debate over a lawn chair, these are mundane friction points that have existed for centuries. What's new is the apparent inability to de-escalate. The shared social scripts that once guided these interactions, apologizing, walking away, seeking mediation, seem to have vanished for some, replaced by an instantaneous and lethal escalation. This points to a broader breakdown in community cohesion and a loss of shared civility. When we no longer see ourselves as part of a collective with a responsibility to maintain peace, every minor affront becomes a personal battle that must be won, often with the most readily available and final tool, violence. The immediate resort to a firearm or a knife in these situations suggests a catastrophic failure of imagination, where the only solution to a problem is its utter annihilation. At the heart of so many of these motives lies the dark side of American individualism and entitlement. The mantra of the self-made individual pursuing their own happiness can curdle into a toxic belief that one's own desires, comfort, and pride are paramount above all else. The man who killed over a marriage rejection felt entitled to a yes. The man who murdered over snoring felt entitled to silence, regardless of his neighbor's medical condition. The sports fan felt his team's superiority was a truth worth killing for. This is individualism stripped of its balancing virtues: empathy, community, and compromise. It creates a world where any impediment to one's wants, no matter how trivial, is seen as an illegitimate injustice that must be violently corrected. The individual's right to be undisturbed, to win an argument, or to claim a parking spot becomes more sacred than another person's right to exist. Ultimately, these bizarre crimes hold up a mirror, and the reflection is unsettling. They show us a society where objects can be valued more than people, where fiction can overwhelm fact, where disagreements are settled with bullets instead of words, and where the pursuit of self has eclipsed the value of the other. They are extreme outliers, yes, but they are built from materials we all recognize: pride, frustration, and the often fraught human struggle to share a world with others. They don't just tell us about the killers, they tell us about the cultural soil in which these tragedies took root, challenging us to cultivate something better. Yet this very public hunger for the strange raises profound ethical questions about the responsibility of the media in its coverage. When the spotlight shines so intensely on the why, the who can tragically fade into the background. The victim, a person with a life, a family, and a story, risks becoming a mere footnote in the more tantalizing narrative of the killer's bizarre motive. This commodification of tragedy reduces human suffering to a plot point in a real-life drama, potentially re-traumatizing grieving families who see their loved one's death discussed more for its entertainment value than its profound human loss. The gravity of the crime, the irreversible act of murder, can be subtly diminished when the conversation centers on the absurdity of the trigger, inadvertently shifting focus from the perpetrator's culpability to the peculiarity of their reasoning. This creates a difficult tightrope for journalists to walk. The public has a right to know the details of notable crimes, and the unusual nature of a motive is undeniably newsworthy. However, the ethical approach lies in contextualizing the bizarre within the framework of the tragic. Responsible reporting demands a balance, acknowledging the unusual aspects of the case without allowing them to eclipse the core facts. A life was stolen, a family was devastated, and a community was left to grapple with a senseless act. It involves framing the story in a way that preserves the dignity of the victim and respects the grief of those left behind, rather than crafting a narrative designed primarily to generate clicks and shock value. The most respectful and informative coverage often comes from a place of sober reflection, not breathless sensationalism. The consequences of sensationalistic reporting can also extend beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing public perception and even the judicial process itself. When a case is dubbed the Slender Man stabbing or the Pokémon card murder, it becomes instantly categorized by its strange element, which can shape how the public views the defendant, the victim, and the nature of the crime itself. This can potentially prejudice potential jurors, making it more difficult to impanel an impartial panel that will focus on the evidence presented in court rather than the media mythology built around the case. Furthermore, the constant repetition of the bizarre motive can, in some instances, risk legitimizing it, giving a platform to irrational defenses or warped worldviews that might otherwise be dismissed. The media's power to name and frame a story carries immense weight, and with that power comes a responsibility to wield it with caution and integrity. In the end, our collective fascination with these stories and the media's eager catering to it reflect a deep human desire to make sense of the senseless. A straightforward murder for money or revenge is horrifying, but it fits within a recognizable, if dark, framework of human behavior. A murder over a spilled drink or a lawn chair does not. The bizarre motive challenges our understanding of the world and our safety within it. If something so trivial can lead to such extreme violence, then nowhere is truly safe. The media taps into this existential anxiety, but the most ethical outlets do so not to simply exploit our fears, but to explore them, providing not just the shocking details but also the necessary context about mental health, societal pressures, and the complex frailties of the human mind that allow such unthinkable acts to occur. From parking spaces to Pokémon cards, from lemonade recipes to the perceived commands of demons, we have journeyed across a truly terrifying spectrum of human motivation. These 33 cases, while each unique in their bizarre details, collectively draw a map of the human psyche's most unpredictable and shadowy corners. They reveal an unsettling truth that resonates far beyond the courtroom or the crime scene. The potential for catastrophic violence can lie dormant in the most mundane aspects of daily life, waiting for a spark of anger, a twist of perception, or a moment of uncontrollable impulse to ignite it. The most profound danger may not always be the stranger in the dark alley, but the simmering resentment over a shared fence, the deeply personal offense taken from a digital slight, or the fragile ego shattered by a simple word, no. This exploration is not meant to suggest that we should live in fear of every minor interaction, but rather to foster a profound awareness of our shared humanity and its inherent frailties. The common thread weaving through these tragedies is a catastrophic failure of empathy, an inability to see the world from another's perspective, to de-escalate a confrontation, or to simply walk away from a dispute that, in the grand scheme of a lifetime, means absolutely nothing. Each story is a monument to a moment where pride was valued over peace, where being right was chosen over being kind, and where a temporary emotion was granted the power to create a permanent, irreversible loss. Ultimately, these bizarre motives hold up a mirror, and the reflection challenges us to be better. They underscore the critical, often undervalued importance of emotional intelligence and conflict resolution, not as abstract concepts, but as essential life skills that maintain the very fabric of our society. The greatest defense against such senseless tragedy is a collective commitment to empathy, to pausing before we react, and to remembering that the person on the other side of an argument is just that, a person whose life is infinitely more valuable than winning a debate over a burger, a chair, or a fictional character. In the end, the most powerful tool we have to prevent the unthinkable is not a weapon, but our own capacity for understanding, our willingness to forgive a slight, and our courage to choose connection over conflict every single day. Thank you for joining me on this deep and unsettling journey through the darkest corners of human motivation. These stories are difficult to sit with, but they offer a vital, if grim, opportunity for reflection. I genuinely value hearing your perspective. Which of these motives did you find the most shocking or difficult to comprehend? Share your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations help us all process the incomprehensible. If you found this exploration into the strange and true compelling, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We're dedicated to uncovering the most fascinating and bizarre stories from history and human behavior, and your support makes that possible. As we step away from these stories and back into our own lives, I'll leave you with this final thought. In a world where a disagreement over a parking spot or a slice of pizza can have fatal consequences, the most radical and powerful act we can practice is kindness. You truly never know what silent battle someone is fighting, or what insignificant moment might be the final straw for a person already on the edge. A little empathy, a deep breath before reacting, and a choice to walk away from a trivial argument are not signs of weakness. They are the very things that hold our shared humanity together. Be good to one another.